Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by BetDSI. Hey, you looking for a place to bet on NFL and NCAA football? BetDSI is the industry leader in football betting and the perfect sportsbook for both novice and professional bettors alike. New members get a 100% bonus match when you use the promo code SEATS100. Yeah, that's SEATS100 at betdsi.com. That's more than double your money to help start winning today. Once again, betdsi.com, promo code SEATS100, and get your limited time 100% bonus offer when you deposit today. Now, here's our show.
So, Wes Unseld, who in 1971 failed as the center of the Baltimore Bullets when they were blown out by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and the Milwaukee Bucks in 4 straight games, and who failed again in 1975 when the Golden State Warriors beat the Washington Bullets by 4 straight, is just 12 ticks of the clock away from his first NBA championship. Paul Silas will take the ball out of bounds. It's been a whale of a campaign, and the tired looks now starting to show on even the fans' faces. It began 8 months ago. Dennis Johnson begins the countdown. They must shoot quickly. It is in and out. Unseld with control. It is about to end. Bobby Dandridge, he will be our most valuable player. Bobby Dandridge voted the CBS most valuable player here in the NBA Championship Series, and the celebration can begin in Washington. Dick Motta and Bernie Bickerstaff are embracing over there as the Washington Bullets jubilantly file off the floor, and the crowd here in Seattle, rather than booing, comes to its feet and gives both these teams a tremendous ovation. Freddie Brown and Wes Unseld shaking hands at midcourt, and it was the Washington Bullets prevailing 105-99, the final score, as they file into their locker room. The commissioner of the NBA, Lawrence O'Brien, is here with some special guests, and Commissioner, why don't you present this trophy?
This is one of the great series of all time in the NBA, and it was played right down to the wire, and we can all be proud of the Supersonics, of course, tonight. And I'm very happy to be here with Jerry Sachs, Bob Ferry, our coach Dick Motta, and Wes Unseld, who has been waiting a while for all of this.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get this show on the road, shall we? How you doing, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and you have stumbled across, perhaps mistakenly so, well, hopefully not, the little podcast we like to call Good Seats Still Available. It's our little curious journey we like to do for you each and every week, devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for coming by. And boy, oh boy, we have a ton of forgotten sports memories to cram into this one little episode as we delve into the very surprising and very deeply rich, and frankly, a lot of it unbeknownst to yours truly, pro basketball history of the city of Washington, D.C. Our guest this week is Brett Abrams. He's the co-author, along with Rafael Mazzone, of a book called The Bullets, the Wizards, and Washington, D.C. Basketball, and it is a tour de force. It's a history, a little walk through the history of the professional game in Washington, D.C., a whole bunch of which I didn't even know about. Now, most people certainly know the Washington Wizards of today, of course, and maybe a good chunk of folks out there listening to this show know that they were known as the Washington Bullets prior to their name change in the mid-1990s. We get into the reasons why in our conversation with Brett in a little while. But the Bullets really kind of synonymized themselves with Washington in the 1970s for sure, when they won their big 1978 NBA championship, Washington, D.C.'s first real substantial professional sports franchise victory championship there in many, many years. But the Bullets were obviously, or maybe not known to a lot of people, actually domiciled in Baltimore for many years prior to them moving to D.C. We get into the story of why that occurred and how and when that occurred. But I'm willing to bet that most people listening to this show don't even know this little factoid, as I kind of just discovered. Before they were in the Baltimore Bullets in 1963, they began their life in the NBA as the Chicago Packers. In 1961, renamed the Chicago Zephyrs in 1962, moving to Baltimore in 63. I didn't know that. Fascinating stuff. But yes, the Washington Wizards can dial their history all the way back to the 1961 Chicago Packers team. And we get into all of that sort of discussion and that sort of history in our conversation. But that's not all, folks. No. We're just kind of getting warmed up because we can go way back. The history of pro basketball dates all the way back to the owner, more well known as the owner of the Washington Now football team. We're not going to sort of reference its name, but the Palace Five, probably one of the original pro basketball teams. George Preston Marshall was the founder of that, and they played in a little place called the Uline Arena in the center of the city there. And that begot about a dozen or 2 years later, Red Auerbach, that name from the Boston Celtics. Well, he kind of got his start with a little team in the American Basketball League called the Washington Capitals, with an O, Capitals. And the Uline Arena, for you folks in the D.C. area, may know that better now as the flagship store of REI in downtown Washington, D.C. Yeah, that used to be the Uline Arena where the Palace Five and the Washington Capitals and even the Washington Tapers of the ill-fated and very short-lived American Basketball League of Abe Saperstein. We've talked about that a little bit with some previous teams like the George Steinbrenner Cleveland Pipers were part of that league. And there's a fascinating little tale there. And yeah, that was Abe Saperstein's little promotional effort to kind of move on from the Harlem Globetrotters and the barnstorming model into an actual challenger professional league of the NBA, the fledgling NBA at that point, 1961-62. And a guy named Earl Foreman comes into the scene. He's the guy who was sort of instrumental, along with Abe Pollin, buying that franchise from Chicago and bringing them the Bullets to Baltimore. But once that went sour for Earl Foreman, by the way, reminder, the co-founder of the Major Indoor Soccer League, hint, hint, see or listen to our conversation with the great Ed Tepper about that. Earl Foreman got bought out by Abe Pollin and the Baltimore Bullets and decided he was going to create a team in Washington, D.C. proper, a rebooted Washington Capitals, known as the Caps, actually, in the ABA, the American Basketball Association. They only lasted a season. But Earl Foreman was thinking, hey, maybe I could get my hands on the Washington, D.C. market if and when the ABA and the NBA merge. It ultimately happened years later. He had to move to Virginia to become the Squires with the ABA, and it didn't sort of work out that well for Earl Foreman in that regard. The Squires did not get absorbed into the NBA, but Abe Pollin did indeed, and some would say was part of forcing Earl Foreman out of D.C. He essentially extended his regional rights, if you will, and moving Baltimore to Washington, D.C. They became the Capital Bullets for a season, if you can believe that. And then they ultimately became the Washington Bullets in, I think it was 74. And that's where they lasted until becoming the Wizards in the mid-90s. But all of that stuff is just, it's all kinds of twists and turns. Washington, D.C., professional basketball. Who knew? Not only all these names and twists and turns, but we get into all of that and more with our guest again this week, Brett Abrams, as we talk Washington, D.C. pro hoops. Fascinating stuff, great book, and intrigue all around in just a few moments' time. A couple of promotional notes, he says. Let's get into a few places where you can perhaps scratch that Washington professional basketball itch. Let's see, in no particular order, how about our pals at ReboundVintageHoops.com? ReboundVintageHoops.com for all kinds of great promotional T-shirt items in the realm of basketball. And if you want to remember the Washington Tapers of the old American Basketball League, they began, by the way, we'll talk about it. They played in the Washington Coliseum. They relocated in the middle of the season to Long Island to become the New York Tapers. And then the season after that, for the half season that was left of the ABL, they moved to Philadelphia. So only a brief amount of time that they were in Washington. But when they were known as the Washington Tapers, you can find that logo on a mug, a T-shirt, a sweatshirt, whatever, at reboundvintagehoops.com. Use the promo code GOODSEATS, and you'll get 10% off all of your purchases, including any of that Washington Tapers stuff that you might like. And there's lots of great teams from various professional basketball leagues for you there. Again, at reboundvintagehoops.com, promo code GOODSEATS, 10% off your Washington Tapers gear and other stuff too. But let's say you want to remember the Washington Caps, the ABA team that was there for a season. There are two great shirts for you at our pals at StreakerSports.com. StreakerSports.com, the purveyors of sports culture, and the promo code for you there is GOODSEATS. And we've got a 10%, no, not 10%, 15% discount for you there. Again, promo code GOODSEATS at StreakerSports.com. And they've got two great shirts, two great logo treatments for the 1969-70 one-year season of the Washington Caps for you to obsess about, choose, and enjoy. So check them out, StreakerSports.com, promo code GOODSEATS. And last but not least, let's say not only were you a Caps fan, but you want to go deeper, and you want to truly commemorate and show your friends that you not only remembered the Washington Caps ABA franchise, but you can't let go, and you want to go that level beyond. Well, how about a custom made with your name on the back of it, if you'd like, Washington Caps retro jersey. Oh yeah. Either in yellow with green trim and green lettering and numerals, or perhaps maybe you like to have that green, that forest green color with the yellow trim and yellow numbers and letters that says Caps on it in both cases. Well, that's our friends at Royal Retros that can help you out there. RoyalRetros.com. And not only will you find jerseys from the Washington Caps, but all kinds of ABA teams. How about the Houston Mavericks, or the Anaheim Amigos, or maybe the San Diego Sails, or how about even the Virginia Squires, where the Washington Caps moved to? Maybe even the Oakland Oaks, the team that actually preceded the Washington Caps. Yeah, that was the franchise, and we talked about it with our pal Pat Boone, the owner of that franchise. That was the franchise after 2 seasons in Oakland that moved to Washington as Earl Foreman bought that franchise and moved it to D.C. Well, you can relive all of that stuff on a daily basis if you want. Just make sure you wash the item. You don't want to stink up the joint, right? You want to keep it nice and clean. And again, that's RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. The promo code for you there is SEATS for 10% off that jersey or any other item that you might like and find at RoyalRetros.com. Again, 10% off for the promo code SEATS at RoyalRetros.com. All right, I think I've exhausted all of those opportunities, but if you're a Washington, D.C. professional hoops fan and you want to go deep and show your understanding and your knowledge, and you want to school your friends, check out those sites and use those promo codes. And please enjoy, courtesy of us and our friends at those various places. Lots of great stuff for you at all of those places and more. And thanks for checking them out. We appreciate it. All right, let's get into our conversation. We're going to get into it now deeply with Brett Abrams. We're going to talk about Washington hoops, all kinds of professional versions and twists and turns. Here's our conversation we had just last week. Please sit back and enjoy. I take it this isn't necessarily your day job, writing books about pro basketball history.
Correct. One sales would be very disappointing if one was relying on putting food on the table for that. What happened is I moved here to Washington and went to school as in history, got a PhD in history, and loved being here. And the city has grown and diversified and become infinitely more exciting. And during that time, it just swept me up. And so my second book is called Capital Sporting Grounds. And what that was about was the fields that existed, don't exist anymore, continue to exist for baseball and football throughout the city. And I talk about the politics of getting them built, and specifically I talk about the reasons behind them. Like, for example, because Washington is the capital, a lot of reasons were for monumental purposes. We were going to have a stadium for Lincoln. We were going to have a stadium for Teddy Roosevelt. This is just to be expected for Washington. I think the most interesting chapter was the one that was devoted to the reasoning for building stadiums, because we were going to host the 2002 Olympics with Baltimore and Alexandria, Virginia. So that got me looking around, and one day I rode what's the Metro, which is the subway system, and looked outside and saw a very strange building. And it's a very cool building. It's called the Uline Arena, and it was named after the guy who built it. It's in the near northeast corridor of Washington. It's where the trains run from when you come into Union Station in Washington, D.C. You pass it. Inevitably, you pass it. And it actually, from that place, you can actually look out and see the nation's Capitol building itself. This fellow who was writing about sports for the local version of the, Village Voice told me that it was an old arena, and it was a coliseum, and it was a place where the Beatles came in 1964, the first place where they played. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So then I looked at the sports aspect of it and found out that an ice maker in the days of the 1930s, a guy who made ice and then provided it to the different businesses and residences around the city, decided that it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a hockey team. So he built one. He built an arena for a hockey team. And that Uline Arena then became this setup for the the second Washington basketball team, which was coached by Red Auerbach, and occurred in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So that's long-winded enough, I figure.
No, that's interesting. So it was the building, and for people who sort of walk by today, I believe it's the flagship store of REI in Washington, D.C., yeah?
Correct, it is. And they did a good job on the historic preservation aspect of it. Both Raphael and I are in the video where they talk about what the building was like before. They use pictures, of course, from the ball games. I mean, it's notable for a variety of different reasons. Most people are attracted to the idea that the Beatles landed there, and after Ed Sullivan, they went down by train and played at what was called the Washington Coliseum at that point in 1964. So that was their opening performance for the first Beatles tour in that era. So that was pretty interesting.
But how did basketball? Yeah, how did basketball ensnare you then? Because given the roots of it being a hockey arena.
So there's the hockey arena lasts from 1941 on. It was called the Washington Lions, was the name of the team. And if Mike Uline became connected to the group of people that were interested in starting the 1940s basketball league, which was called the Basketball Association of America. And it was going to compete against what was called the National Basketball League, which had one of the most notable players of that era, George Mikan. He was playing, and the National Basketball League was a league that focused mostly on the Rust Belt areas of Indianapolis and Akron and those smaller cities. And so what the basketball group did in the East was form a group of people that would play under the BAA, and that included New York, Chicago, St. Louis, basically the route that was the same structure that was used for the Major League Baseball in that era. So New York, Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, and that was really about as far as it went. So Uline got involved with that group of people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so in essence, minor league hockey was the primary reason, but basketball was becoming And we've talked about that in various episodes, right? This was becoming more of a professional thing, that you're talking about the two direct feeder leagues that ultimately became the NBA.
Exactly, the two feeder leagues. And so what was interesting was Auerbach was serving in the Navy in 1942-43, and of course was playing basketball and got to know people like Bones McKinney, who was from North Carolina, and some of these other people that had played college basketball and were now playing semi-pro or were in the Navy themselves. And so he actually got in touch with Uline, and Uline and he formed a team together, and Auerbach brought most of his friends to the team along with himself. And so they were actually pretty strong. They were mostly, I think Red Auerbach is the most interesting character of all the people that were involved with that Capitals team. But in the third season, that Capitals team played the Minneapolis Lakers with Mikan for the championship of the league. They were that good.
And the rise of basketball around that time, right? I mean, DC, obviously in the Northeast and the Midwest, right, was pretty much the sort of the origins of the pro game, you know, and really, in many respects, DC was more than holding its own already. I mean, I think a lot of people sort of, you know, give New York and Philadelphia certainly a lot of props as sort of the early progenitors of the game and quality. But this Washington Capitals team, late 40s, early 1950s, right, seemed to be pretty scrappy, and you couldn't do worse than having a guy like Auerbach, right?
No, in fact, Auerbach's the key player. And as far as the engine that makes the team work, the person who puts the right players out on the court, the person who makes the right trades, the person who negotiates the contracts. Unfortunately, he was going on a 1 year by 1 year basis. And so Uline decided that he didn't want to give him a multiple year contract, and Auerbach walked away. And when Auerbach walked away, a guy named Bob Ferrick became the team's coach. And even though they made the playoffs the next year, the team basically fell from good graces at that point. And by the fifth year, they were actually going to drop out of the league. And they dropped out of the league in 1951.
Yeah, so I think most people don't recognize that when the NBA was finally announced, that merger, if you will, of the BAA and the NBL, Washington Capitals were part of the first ever assemblage of quote-unquote NBA franchises.
Correct. They were, and they were also the first to ever use an African-American player, a guy by the name of Earl Lloyd. So that's kind of fun. And they actually had Bill Sharman on their team. So both Bill Sharman and Earl Lloyd were friends. They both went into military service together because the Korean War breaks out. And so they have to go and put their time into the Army, which, of course, debilitated the Washington Capitals roster, which basically made it almost impossible for the team to play well. And when the team didn't play well, nobody came to see the games. I mean, there's some fascinating stuff about Washington and segregation, which I would like to talk a little bit about with the Uline Arena.
Well, sure. Go ahead. I mean, this is a city, right?
Washington's a segregated.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to talk about DC, right? It's got the best and the worst of both the Northeast and the Southeast, right?
Correct. It does. And so it is segregated. And so black people could not go to basketball games at Uline, but could go to boxing events. I mean, very strange, very, very particular and unique rules. And so during that time, there was a huge hue and cry, as you would expect, and an effective protest that they held on a regular basis outside Uline Arena. And it worked. And so Uline caved and allowed for African Americans to come and see the game of basketball or hockey or whatever else was going on at the arena at that time. And that's a big deal because at that point, Griffith Stadium is segregated, which is the place where the Washington Senators played. So that's also where the Washington Redskins of that old name played. And so that was a segregated place. And the only place where African Americans and white people could meet and mingle would be the public library, which was it was a Carnegie Library that sits in the middle of the city, basically on Palatial, Massachusetts Avenue. So the work, getting Uline to cave and for mixing of African Americans and Caucasians in that 1948 period is a huge breakthrough. And then, of course, it's rather touching that we in Washington have the first African American player in NBA history who ever took the court. So I think that's kind of fun too.
All right. Well, let me stop you there because now I actually want to go back a step, because when you bring up racial segregation and Washington, D.C. and sports, you now hit the tripwire of a guy named George Preston Marshall, right? And I think most of our listeners, from our previous conversations about the Washington football team, its origins, the original ownership, how they came into the NFL. This was a guy who was not shy about his views on segregation. And ironically, or maybe not so, he's actually an integral part of our little conversation today because he was actually part of arguably the first real professional basketball franchise years earlier in D.C.
Right, exactly. The American Basketball League, which was ironically founded by people like George Halas, who was struggling at that point to bring the National Football League into its own. And so it turns out Harris and Marshall become friendly with each other through a guy named Joe Carr, who was also part of the National Football League. And they decided in 1925 that there could be money made out of a national basketball group, and they called it the American Basketball League. And so that starts in the mid-20s. Before that, there were barnstorming teams, especially the New York Celtics, which was a group of people that played basketball and went from place to place and took on the best players of that city and usually beat them. They were key ball handlers. They were great shooters. And so usually they drew crowds of like 2,000 to 3,000 people. They'd set up an arena. The arena would be surrounded by a cage, which I think we have to understand is where the notion of a cager comes from in basketball history. The term is sometimes synonymous with basketball players, and it means that they were literally playing inside of a ring, sometimes not very bigger than a dance floor that was surrounded by a cage. And frequently that cage was used to keep people who were throwing things onto the floor from doing too much damage. I mean, it's a kind of an interesting era, you know. I mean, we can't even imagine how anybody would. Well, we do know. We've seen Russell Westbrook. We've seen Ron Artest react violently to being egged on, literally and figuratively, by fans. So only imagine what it would have been like had they been in this cage and been forced and subjected to people throwing tomatoes and other things at them. But so this league basically started with teams in all the Northeast cities: Boston, Brooklyn, Buffalo, Chicago, Cleveland, and Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Washington, D.C., and Detroit. So those are the big teams that are playing. They divide it up into two leagues, and somebody comes up with the genius idea of splitting they play the first champion would be for the half of the league, and then the second champion would be the second half of the league, and then the two winners would play off in the playoffs. So that's how they divided it.
Why do you think, as you look back, why do you think, I can probably guess the economic reason, but why did the Washington Palace Five, as they would know, I think they're also known as the Laundrymen, little story behind that too, right? Why do they only last a handful of years in the 20s, and then sort of dissipate until the Capitals came along almost 20 years later?
Right. Well, Marshall's into everything to make money. He does like to have attention paid to him, and there's kind of this joke about Gorgeous George. And I even referenced, looking at his picture, that he kind of cuts a suave look. He ran a company called the Palace Laundry Dry Cleaning Company in an era when people didn't have washers and dryers in their house, barely had space for rooms to keep their beds. So everybody had to actually use the laundry services, and his was the biggest one in Washington. He took it over from his father, who ran a West Virginia company, and turned it into a mega business. And so with that in mind, he thinks, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to basically improve my stock by linking myself up with popular culture, with a sports team. And they played in a place called the Arcadia, which was, on usual basis, a dance floor. And they played on Wednesdays and Sunday nights, and they drew a pretty good crowd, and then most of the people would stay and dance afterwards. So I think it's kind of interesting to talk about what kind of game we're talking about. You know, there are some references to this game in some box. You try to look at a box score and try to understand what in the world happened, and it really doesn't tell you the whole thing. It just gives you a little snippet that you can possibly even misinterpret. In some of these games, they had 50 fouls. It's grabbing, it's pulling people down, it's very rough and tumble. You're only going to the foul line for a single shot, so you can only score 1 point if you're going to the foul line as opposed to shooting from the outside. And the ball is warped, and they haven't even developed a sense of a set shot yet. So you really had to get in close to score. So there was a lot of mugging. And that's pretty much what the game was like. So it's a very rough and tumble game. And it's interesting that it was a very highly immigrant game. It drew a lot of Italian and Jewish immigrants in the Northeast who were drawn to both the opportunity to play sports, but also the opportunity to make a decent check. I mean, some of these guys are making $800 for playing, and the great ones are making $5,000 to $10,000 in this new league.
It's also a social event, though, too, right? For because of the dance and the sort of component afterwards, right? It was kind of like an event, a social circle, especially for those either ethnic or social club kind of things, right? Where the basketball and dancing and probably some food, and it's a whole night, right? Full of stuff.
Exactly. It's a whole night. And what's interesting about that is, and it kind of puts basketball into context a little bit. I think, especially nowadays, when we look at what the NBA is and the amount of coverage that it gets, I don't think we can even fathom what it was like in the 20s and the 40s and the 50s, where these guys, I mean, I talk a lot. I'm a labor historian by training, and so I'm very focused on what it was like to travel, what it was like, how much your per diem was. These guys, even through the 50s, these men who are 6'6", 6'7", would cram 3 and 4 to a car and drive from Rochester to Fort Wayne to be able to get to a game. So that is so far afield from what we're used to thinking about. And so often the people that went to the game, as you're saying, would use it for an opportunity to cluster around like-minded people or people from their own community. And that continued through the 1940s, where sometimes they had musical acts or some second half of the event so that people could get a full night out of it. As one person said, if I'm going to spend $5 on a date, I don't want it to end by 9 o'clock.
Wink, wink, nod, nod, but,
Yeah. Exactly. So that is pretty much, I mean, that's what the servicemen were thinking when they were coming back and starting to date some of these women in 46 and 47 and 48. They want to have something else. They don't want to, I mean, it's expensive to go to a game, so they want to be there for 3 to 4 hours, and they want to have the opportunity to get to know the person that they're with. and to show them a good time.
Yeah, and I think for what you're also hinting at too is this also essentially connects with the history of the sport professionally too, because around that, I mean, you're describing, for a couple of decades, it's sort of this melange of social activity and the cager thing, and the rules are still relatively the industrial component of it, where people are working by day, playing by night, and the barnstorming and the bus rides and all that kind of stuff. And the ABL for many, many years was, I want to call it ragtag, but it was certainly it was industrial, both pejoratively as well as literally, right? And I think that's kind of probably one of the reasons that a team, if really didn't sort of come about, another professional team, until the late 40s, when both of these fledgling professional leagues were getting going. And it only made sense, I guess, given the early history for DC to get one of those initial pro franchises. I'm just surprised that that the Capitals didn't last more than about 4 or 5 seasons. I get the sense that they kind of went down a rung after they sort of left what was now the NBA. After starting in the BAA, they kind of took a step down and played in they went back down, if you will, to the original ABL and kind of played more of the ragtag version until they fully dissipated a year later.
Right. That's exactly what happened. They were in the NBA for a little while, but they didn't have once they lost Auerbach, they lost the genius, the basketball genius. And that had to do with both play on the court, but also people that you would get. I mean, he had that. And without that, there was nobody strong enough to lead it. And then Bob Ferrick eventually leaves for the safer confines of college basketball. And now they're basically bankrupt, both as a group of players, but also in their leadership. They had a leadership board. I mean, that's something that unfortunately seems to have crippled a lot of Washington basketball franchises. Is a little bit of a brain drain, so to speak, or not getting the right people in the first place. I mean, the other ABL if we want to go a little further, Abe Saperstein decides that he wants to get into the NBA, and the owners won't let him. The guy who owned the Harlem Globetrotters. So he starts a league, the second version of the American Basketball League, in 1961. And Washington joins that as one of the professional team entries. And so, I mean, that's kind of an interesting story in its own right, because this new league is happening at the same time that the AFL is starting in football.
Yeah, and let's put this in context, right? This is about 10 years or so after the NBA had itself been created from out of the loins of the BAA and the NBL. And you also recognize, too, that somebody like Abe Saperstein, right, very involved in, especially in the Philadelphia area, a lot of sort of the early stuff about basketball in its very early days, as we were just describing. So this is a guy who's been around and has been making money, if you will, albeit, in sort of a barnstorming fashion, professionally, right? So if he's not allowed somehow to come into the NBA, and there's various reasons as to why that was the case, he's like, well, maybe I can get a few of my fellow arena owners who feel similarly. Let's challenge the NBA. And there's plenty of more cities that could benefit from professional basketball now that it's becoming a thing. But as you're going to describe in a minute, not only did that not last very long, I think it was officially a season and a half. This franchise, why don't you describe the history of this franchise? Because even though the league only lasted a year and a half, this franchise had an interesting, its own journey within that year and a half.
Harry Lynn, this guy who owns the Washington Coliseum, he bought it off the widow of Mike Uline, decides that, hey, I need some entertainment. And he loses the job that he was doing in Washington, and the family wants to stay in Washington, D.C. So he thinks, I can make money running this business. And so he goes and gets in contact with a man named Paul Cohen, who was running an industrial team called the Tapers. and he gives Cohen basically the reins to stock and start the Washington basketball team. You can imagine, just thinking about this for a minute, you're taking an industrial team as your core players. That's a pretty bad start, in my mind, And so that's what was one of the elements behind this. But I just want to talk a little bit briefly about where Saperstein's business sense is coming from. Television is now bursting out into all kinds of individual homes across the country. I mean, obviously television starts in the 30s, but really becomes a big deal in some of the major eastern cities during the late 1940s. But by the 50s, with shows like I Love Lucy and everything else, it becomes something that everybody's watching. And so televised sports is definitely an opportunity. And the AFL saw that opportunity with football, and Saperstein thought they would have the same opportunity with basketball. What he didn't understand was basketball was nowhere near as popular as football. So he couldn't get that kind of contract, the kind of money that kept the AFL afloat while it was fighting the NFL and while it was offering contracts to players that could seduce them to play for an AFL team. The ABL didn't have that. So basically, it's a kind of interesting story about where the whole idea is coming from. But there were a couple of things that doomed the ABL besides the business aspect of it. One was that they were going to have a franchise in Los Angeles. Now, that would be a huge deal because if you think about it, 1961, there's no team in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles had just gotten the Dodgers in 1958. So in other words, professional sports had woken up to the idea that, yes, there were people that were living out in the West Coast, and they would want to support a team too. And we could get a television market for those big populations also. And it didn't cost as much with jet travel to move your teams around. So it just made it feasible to open up this market. And Saperstein thought he would get his LA Jets into the arena in Los Angeles, and he was outmaneuvered by the leaders of the Minneapolis Lakers and the NBA, which got Minneapolis, which was kind of down on its luck and losing some of its audience and appeal, to move to Los Angeles. And they got the arena, they got the rights to play. So that kind of doomed them there too. But are there some things that you were thinking about that you wanted me to talk about with the Tapers?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the Tapers, right? So the Tapers essentially began with the ABL in 1961, but their origin, you were hinting at it before, I don't think we got specifically to it. Their origin was as an amateur team, and they weren't even based in Washington for that. They were based in New York. So how does that all how does that become the genesis or the core of a team in Washington, D.C. in this new league?
Well, Lynn runs out of money and needs money to be able to pay the franchise fee to be able to be in the ABL. And so he goes looking for money, and he finds Paul Cohen, who's the president of what's called the Technical Tape Corporation in New Rochelle. And so he fronts him $100,000 or so to be able to buy in to the rights to have this basketball, to be part of this basketball team. And then since Lynn knows very little about the basketball world, he basically forfeits those decisions over to Cohen. So not a bad deal for $85,000 to $100,000. You inherit basically the decision making of this team. So I think there's a couple of things that stood out for me about that team, which was the fact that Gene Connolly, who was both a professional basketball player, he played with the Celtics, and he also played professional baseball with the Red Sox, played with the Tapers. So he was actually a member of the Tapers in this league for a short period of time. And I spend a little time talking about the rarity of guys who are actually good at multiple sports and became professionals at multiple sports. I don't know if that jumps out at you at all as something to talk about, but I think just for the sake of it, I think it's interesting to note that Dave DeBusschere, was one of them. And then one of my other interesting ones was a guy named Ron Reed, who played both baseball and basketball. And then the most recent one that I can think of, or maybe there's two, the one that sticks in my head because he was still part of the NBA world until last year, was Danny Ainge. Danny Ainge played second base, I think, for the Toronto Blue Jays. And, of course, we all know him as a guard with the Celtics.
Yeah, I doing some research. I think Connolly was even sort of pulled into sort of doing promotional work for the Tuck Tape Company along the way.
That makes sense. I mean, goodness sakes, you've got this asset.
Yeah.
Let's use them for every chance they get.
Well,
I think the most interesting conversation. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so give me a sense though. But the team did not last long in DC because again, we're talking about a team that in the league it only lasted a year and a half. But by the middle of the first season, they moved to New York, the Comac Arena of all places, which is legendarily woeful as the ABA version of the New York Nets found out a number of years later. But then they even moved to. Didn't they move to Philadelphia for the next season, which only became a half season? So, what's the story behind bouncing around there?
Exactly. They were an itinerant basketball team or a group of nomads. Let's call them that, because basically the league itself. I mean, the other downfall of the league is, obviously, you finding stars, finding name players to fill out, to draw the spectators, and then you're traveling. My favorite part of this league is that they actually had a Hawaiian Chiefs team. So could you imagine the cost of the investment, the cost of flying your team out there to Hawaii, and then they play multiple games because they didn't want to fly back until they had played out the time that they were going to play in Hawaii. And so that also ended up drawing little interest from those fans that might have been interested in the first place in Hawaii. But I think the most telling story, I talked to Kaiser, and he basically had very positive memories of the experience. I mean, he joked about being the notable player on the team, i.e. the high scorer, But he actually said he had a really nice time playing. He only meant to play for 3 years as a pro anyway. He came out of Georgia Tech. And so for him, he got a contract that guaranteed him to be paid for 3 years. So he was kind of a happy camper whether the team lasted that long or not. But he told a great story about going out to dinner with some of his African-American teammates at a local diner near the stadium in Northeast near 3rd Street. And they were looking at menus, and the guys were grousing on the other side of the table. The African Americans in particular complaining about how expensive the sandwiches were. And Kaiser looked at the menu that he had in front of him, and he said, "But it's only $4 for a sandwich." And they said, "Double that." And then they actually showed him that they had a second menu. That they got a menu that was given to them that had double the price of all the stuff that Kaiser had gotten because Kaiser was a Caucasian man.
Jeez.
Yeah, so I think that kind of gives you another sense of what some of the African-American players were up against in some of these cities, especially some of the quote-unquote southern cities. And I think this comes to fruition when we talk about Earl Monroe and Earl Monroe as a player with the Baltimore Bullets.
Well, but before we get there, though, I don't want to bury the ABL too quickly because I think in many respects it's also it was ahead of its time, right? From a lot of what Saperstein was thinking, but also from rules innovations, right? The 3-point shot and a 30-second shooting clock and a wider free throw lane. And an envisionment, frankly, again, probably years early, around a growing nation that could be literally a coast-to-coast professional sporting endeavor, and perhaps even including in that this budding thing known as television. But, again, the NBA certainly had a 10-year head start, right? And you were sort of mentioning it earlier before, right? I mean, talking about the NFL and the AFL, right? The AFL in the early 60s made a little bit, perhaps maybe in history's retrospect, right? A little bit more sense because pro football had been more of a thing for a little bit longer period of time. Not so with the professional basketball thing, which was probably about 20 years the NFL's junior.
Right. Exactly. And I think, we talk about what kind of ground was sown for these two different sports. College football, which some of these players were coming out of, that were going into the NFL, was huge. It had an incredible devotion throughout the West, the Midwest, and the South of this country. So there was a built-in audience right there for some of those stars that were moving from the ranks of Alabama to go to become Joe Willie Namath, with the New York Titans / Jets. So there was a bit of an easier sell. College basketball, of course, eventually developed a big cadre, a big fans, but for the most part, especially in the 1950s, and we can talk about the scandals and the betting scandals in the 1950s. A lot of college basketball.
We don't have to talk about that too much in historical perspective because it's coming back again. You just wait, given the professional betting thing that's going on. What could go wrong with that?
This time we hope it's legal.
Right. Well, we'll see about that. The integrity of the game be damned.